Soren Kierkegaard, Chapter 5. Kierkegaard's way of expressing his convictions in word and deeds affected to the breaking point his relationship with Bishop Meinster, Professor Nielsen, and his brother. Much of what he said and wrote was open to misinterpretation. Although he abandoned his method of indirect communication in his final years when launching his attack upon the church, Copenhagen pilloried him, quote, with deadly grins, close quote. It is likely that his final and undisguised attacks upon, quote, official Christianity, close quote, remained incomprehensible to the average church member of his day. But the higher clergy must have sensed how irrefutable and prophetic his writings were. He shared with the later Nietzsche the fate of many a genius in remaining unrecognized for too long a time in his own country, and partly on account of the little-known Danish language in all Europe and America. Quote, the lull and deadness of order, close quote, of which Dostoevsky speaks with much less justification than Kierkegaard, was a heavy mist hanging over the spiritual and intellectual sky of Denmark. The country's obtuseness to basic religious thinking was likewise affected by political events in the 1840s. Soren Kierkegaard directed these religious attacks against his father's confession, Bishop Meinster, who had confirmed him at the age of 15 and whose administrative skill and polished oratory had retrieved many of Denmark's leading citizens from an active share in church life. Kierkegaard considered Meinster the symbol of Christianity's compromise with the state and with worldly interests. The state, so Kierkegaard maintained, dominated the church, whereas the church should have shaken its members out of the middle-class complacency that made them, quote, listen with their hands folded over the stomach directly, a sleepy look upward, close quote. Meinster, the government-appointed church president, was to Kierkegaard an enemy of Christ's teachings. According to Kierkegaard, there never could be a reconciliation between the world and the demands of Christ. The two were poles apart. If Christ were to come again, he would encounter the same hostility as of old. A generation before Dostoevsky wrote his classical scene between the unbelieving Grand Inquisitor and the returned Christ, Kierkegaard had already envisioned some of the essence of this remarkable Russian legend. Meinster was to him a gentle but nonetheless dangerous forebear of the demonic Grand Inquisitor. He and his clerical subordinates had made a successful career of preaching Christ's prophecy that his followers would be persecuted. The very foundation of Christianity in Denmark and all Europe rested not on spiritual strength, but on the political power and financial resources of the state. To be a Christian, in Kierkegaard's opinion, could mean only to be persecuted. To be a, quote, unquote, single one before God and lonely among men. Now that everyone had become a nominal Christian, Christianity had ceased to exist. The church was a travesty to Christianity. Soren Kierkegaard centered his attack on this state of affairs upon Bishop Meinster, whom he made the symbol of a complacent and well-established Lutheran church. Actually, the bishop, while rather unoriginal in his thinking, was a well-meaning and unambitious man. A similar and even more painful conflict arose between Soren and his brother, Peter Christian, Bishop of Aalborg, a quieter and less conspicuous figure than Meinster. In defending himself, Peter went so far as to publish, during these controversies, a lecture against Soren, characterizing him as unrealistic, ecstatic, and eccentric. His one remaining confidant was Professor Nielsen, but Soren was soon to discover that the respected scholar exploited many of his privately expressed thoughts in his own philosophical publications. Soren realized then that he was to remain forever a lonely prophet in the wilderness, truly a single one before God. His road was the Via Solitaria. From that time on, 1846, he confided his intimate thoughts only to his various journals. He had reached the final stage of solitude and was now confronted only by God. Kierkegaard wanted no pity, though he had hoped to have a fair hearing for his message. Like Nietzsche, he wanted no disciples, quote, the greatest of all misfortunes, close quote. Yet to find himself almost without sympathizers was a bitter Gethsemane experience. He could not forget Regine Olsen and his broken engagement. Indeed, he owed her memory such profound insight into man's relationship with God that the somewhat over-enthusiastic Russian philosopher Shestov, who met Kierkegaard in his later life, declared that Regine Olsen was more important than the discovery of America. Repeatedly, Kierkegaard likened the individual's relationship with God to a lover's experience. It is at once painful and happy, passionate but unfulfilled, lived in time yet infinite. Once he had separated himself from Regine Olsen, he was free to enter upon his, quote, engagement to God, close quote. Toward the end of his short life, in a series of vehemently worded leaflets known as The Moment or The Instant, he extended his criticism of Danish conditions to an attack upon all Christianity. The leaflets were primarily directed against Professor Martensen, who had publicly spoken of the deceased Bishop Meinster as a witness of truth. Kierkegaard was incensed by the use of the term quote-unquote witness, parentheses, meaning quote-unquote martyr in the Greek original, close parentheses. For a highly paid career minister, the quote little word quote rallied every vestige of his waning energy for the writing of those indignant pages which have become classic in their power to arouse a Christian conscience.